I first started delving into the history of airships, the concept of Tartaria was completely foreign to me. I wasn't concerned with lost civilizations or buried technologies. I simply wanted to understand why, in the late 1800s, the skies suddenly teemed with colossal flying machines, and why they vanished as quickly as they appeared. The official explanation is something everyone has heard countless times: that these airships were merely experimental, highly dangerous, with hydrogen gas being too unstable, and the technology of the era wasn't advanced enough. For a long time, that explanation sounded perfectly plausible until you actually started putting the pieces together. Because the surviving photographs weren't of flimsy toys. They depicted towering machines as imposing as skyscrapers. They documented highly professional ground support crews, robust infrastructure, mooring masts, colossal hangars, and a logistics system with a distinctly military character. They revealed a standardized process, not a series of fumbling experiments. And it was this standardization that caused the official historical narrative to begin to crack. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, airships were not rare. They weren't secret. They certainly weren't legends. They were ubiquitous. From Europe to the Americas, Russia, hovering over major cities, crossing oceans, and flying above industrial centers. Newspapers reported on them routinely, and governments openly poured money into their development. People below looked up without any sign of astonishment or fear. This raised the first thorny question. If these airships were truly so inefficient, why did so many nations rush to build them simultaneously? People often attribute it to technological optimism, but optimism alone cannot create an entire airship fleet. Optimism cannot erect colossal airship hangars, and certainly optimism cannot train crews, engineers, navigators, and support teams spanning continents. Only a complete infrastructure system can achieve that, and building infrastructure implies absolute confidence. The deeper I delved into the archives, the more I uncovered something truly peculiar. The size of these airships evolved at a dizzying pace. In just a few decades, designs progressed dramatically from small, rudimentary balloons to rigid-framed vessels hundreds of meters long. This evolution wasn't gradual or cautious. It was a monumental leap. Such a leap can usually only come from one source: inherited knowledge. When a society truly invents something from scratch, the development process is usually slow and piecemeal. But when they rediscover an old technology, even just a small part of it, the pace of progress accelerates phenomenally. And this is precisely the scenario we are witnessing. These airships didn't emerge as crude, rudimentary products, but rather as nearly complete systems from the outset. They possessed internal framework structures, a sophisticated arrangement of gas cells, and advanced aerodynamic control surfaces, cargo compartments capable of carrying vehicles, heavy equipment, and a large crew. This cannot be the picture of a technology still in its infancy. Next is the second absurdity. It's the locations. These airships were not operating randomly. Strangely, they always hovered around old-world cities, places already renowned for their magnificent architecture, strange energy infrastructure, and inexplicable construction techniques. These are also the places where we find colossal foundations, buried levels, and underground tunnels of unknown purpose. Or towers, domes, and spires that seem to serve no purpose. In other words, we are talking about cities characterized by what researchers call Tartarian or Old World architecture. And this coincidence truly makes one ponder, because if airships were simply a 19th century invention, then why were they concentrated only in places that already bore traces of a much older and more advanced infrastructure? And this is where the story takes a major turn. The deeper I delved into these photographs, the more I noticed another detail. These airships were not regarded as risky experimental machines at all. People stood casually right beneath them. Boats passed freely below, and city life continued as usual while they hovered overhead. This absence of fear reveals a core truth. People had complete trust in these machines. They were not experimental products or risky demonstrations, but rather a stable, reliable operational system. And then another equally remarkable truth emerged: the pervasive silence. After decades of development, funding, and widespread adoption, all records suddenly vanished. There was no gradual decline, no persistent debates about safety, and no transition period. They simply dissolved into thin air. Only by the early 20th century were airships suddenly reportrayed as failed and dangerous experiments, their actual operational scale downplayed. Their entire supporting infrastructure was dismantled, and their original purpose completely rewritten. And so, the course of history continued, yet technology rarely disappears in this manner. Especially a technology backed by governments, militaries, and investors worldwide. Unless, of course, it didn't belong to the era it was assigned. And this is when the concept of Tartaria subtly enters the discussion, not as a myth or a tangible empire, but as a layer of technology that doesn't fit our mainstream timeline. A technological layer that continuously surfaces both beneath and above our cities. Because if the old world truly possessed superior architectural systems, energy principles, and engineering on a colossal scale, for them, air travel wasn't an option, but a necessity. This brings us to the central question of this investigation. Were the airships of the 1800s truly an invention of that era, or were they simply reactivated legacies, remnants of a much older system? Because the speed of development, scale, and confidence behind this technology suggests something far more ominous than a failed invention. It suggests a rediscovery. Before we delve deeper, I want to make one thing clear. Everything you are about to see is based on photographs, technical records, and historical documents that still exist today, even if they are rarely discussed. If you appreciate in-depth research, meticulous analysis, and questions to which history doesn't always have clear answers, please remember to subscribe. Your support is the motivation for this channel to continue searching for evidence that people often deliberately ignore. Now let's continue, and in this part, we will begin to explore the first tangible traces. That is the ground infrastructure system, which existed long before these airships flew in the sky. And a bigger question, why did this entire system vanish at the same time as the airships? The deeper I delved into this research, the more I realized a core truth. That the airships themselves are only half the story, because any vehicle, no matter how advanced, cannot operate in isolation. They always require an infrastructure system, including support stations and sturdy mooring points on the ground. And then, when you temporarily take your eyes off the sky and start observing the cities below more closely, you will see a completely different picture emerge. Throughout the 19th century, long before airplanes were invented, and even further back than modern aviation, cities worldwide were quietly building, or perhaps inheriting, architectural structures that were utterly illogical in a purely industrial context. These were towering spires, tall and slender pinnacles, and vast flat rooftops perched high above. Platforms placed in unexpected locations. They weren't factories, nor industrial chimneys, and certainly not observatories. These were structures that didn't fit any official explanation. When I began comparing old photographs from major cities like Paris, London, St. Petersburg, or Chicago, the commonalities became undeniably clear. These cities were thousands of miles apart, differing in politics, language, and even construction techniques. Yet their urban planning revealed strangely recurring features. Vast, empty rooftops with heavily reinforced edges and towers erected near administrative centers instead of industrial zones. Platforms attached to government buildings, not to cargo warehouses. And structures resembling bell towers, yet built far more robustly than their purely decorative purpose would suggest, according to mainstream history. It's believed they were built merely for aesthetics, to display prestige, or simply as a symbol. But a symbolic structure wouldn't need a load-bearing steel core, nor would it require internal ladders, or hollow compartments and heavy-duty reinforced mooring points. Yet all these structures possess these features. In Paris, old photographs reveal towering spires erected near galleries and government buildings long before the Eiffel Tower even existed. Some of them were later dismantled, while others were renovated to the point where their original form is unrecognizable. Even in London, one finds an abundance of towers and elevated roof structures appearing near railway hubs, public offices, and along the riverbanks. Locations that inherently require coordinated movement and panoramic views, but perhaps nowhere is as mysterious as St. Petersburg. Here, massive towers are arranged with astonishing geometric precision throughout the city. They are not aligned with any churches, nor with any fortresses, but instead form a perfect alignment with open spaces above canals and wide avenues. Or take Chicago, a city that mainstream history describes as young and rapidly built. Old photographs, however, show heavily reinforced rooftops and elevated platforms existing even before the first skyscrapers, before modern cranes, and long before the formation of the so-called industrial skyline that our books teach us about. This forces us to ask an unavoidable question. What was the true purpose of these structures? They are too robust if merely for show, too widespread to be considered mere experiments, and their strange uniformity across continents cannot simply be coincidental. But what's even more intriguing are the things they lack. No trace of storage facilities, not a speck of soot. No drainage systems visible, nor any fuel lines in a century obsessed with internal combustion engines. The cleanliness of these structures is truly puzzling. From this, an astonishing hypothesis begins to emerge. What if they weren't created for industrial purposes, but were, in fact, a legacy inherited from something entirely different? And this is where the name Tartaria enters the narrative, not as a myth or an imaginary empire, but rather as a universal blueprint, a common architectural language, a system that manifested repeatedly in cities long before today's urban planners even came into existence. The towering spires seem designed to conquer the sky, not for defense. The platforms appear to be for access, not for storing goods. And those spiral structures, they evoke broadcasting stations more than mere monuments. And when we cross-reference these ground-level structures, with records of airship activity from the same era, a suspicious correlation emerges, airships suddenly appearing in the skies. Of cities already equipped with elevated access points, these flying vessels hovering right next to towers whose specific purpose was unclear. Photos even show airships docked directly over residential areas rather than industrial zones or ports. It's as if the entire city was already prepared for them, not newly built, but repurposed. According to this hypothesis, 19th century engineers didn't invent the airship era at all. They merely patched together the remaining fragments of a system they themselves didn't fully comprehend, an aerial network whose physical mooring points were already embedded within the city's structure. And perhaps this explains why countless structures of this type were later demolished, lowered, or redesignated for a different purpose, because once the aerial connection component was gone, the ground-level system of structures suddenly became isolated relics, an architecture that no longer aligned with the official history. Towers were renamed, platforms repurposed, the original function of the pointed spires faded into oblivion, and the historical narrative was rewritten accordingly. The sky was no longer a pathway connecting cities. Airships now became strange, rare objects, and all the infrastructure that once served them quietly slipped into the past. However, the true mystery doesn't lie in the function of these structures, but in how those airships glided, smokeless, silent, and leaving no trace of fuel. And that very fact leads us to the technology itself. This is where the story takes a different turn. Up until now, we've examined what flew in the sky and the ground structures that supported them. But this third part delves into something far more inexplicable. Because once you've accepted the existence of colossal airships in the skies above cities, and when you've clearly seen the infrastructure that appears to have been created to serve them, the next question inevitably arises. How did they actually operate? They weren't free-floating, nor were they aimlessly drifting in the wind. Instead, they moved with astonishing precision between cities when you meticulously examine the historical photos and records. One peculiar detail consistently emerges. These airships operated nothing like conventional balloons. Witnesses reported that they could stop abruptly in mid-air, change direction without turning, and hover for extended periods over specific locations. They descended slowly and deliberately, without tethers, nor pulled down by gravity, and most importantly, they operated in absolute silence. There was no trace of smoke or exhaust fumes, no visible fuel systems, and no roaring engines were heard. That detail alone challenges conventional explanations, because 19th century propulsion technology, whether steam-powered or internal combustion, always left traces: smoke, soot, noise, and heat distortion. Yet in the hundreds of surviving photographs, the sky around these vessels was always clear. Even when they flew very low over cities, even when they hovered above harbours, and even when they remained stationary for extended periods, not a trace, not a speck of residue. No observable operating mechanism. This was also the point where contemporary engineers began to feel stumped. It was in scientific journals in the mid-1800s that inventors constantly complained about the same obstacle, the weight of fuel. On one hand, the ability to take off and maintain balance. On the other, the sight of aimless drifting. Yet strangely, at the same time, newspapers painted a completely different picture, telling of airships gliding with incredible stability, a near magical silence. Thus, two streams of information existed in parallel. One stream asserted that it was fantastical, impossible to achieve, while the other firmly stated it was happening right before their eyes. And when we compare the designs of airships from various countries, another strange thing comes to light, the astonishing similarity in their designs. We see sleek, perfectly balanced, and smooth hulls with virtually no visible propulsion systems, no bulky paddle wheels, nor any oversized propellers. If the propulsion was mechanical, it was very well hidden, and if it had to be hidden, then perhaps it wasn't the kind of mechanical engine we know. It was at this point that some researchers shifted their focus. They were no longer looking for engines, but for energy sources, because the architectural structures we discussed in Part 2, from the towers and spires to the domes and elevated platforms, all shared a common characteristic. They all possessed a strong ability to interact with the atmosphere through their height, conductive materials, symmetrical structures, and resonant geometry. These characteristics were repeatedly found in Old World structures, which many believe were designed by the Tartarians. Their purpose wasn't merely ornamental, but to serve a specific function. When we set aside contemporary ways of thinking, a completely new hypothesis emerges. Perhaps these airships weren't powered by internal energy sources at all, but were very likely energized from an external source. Energy derived from atmospheric pressure differentials, energy from electrical potential differences, and energy from resonance with our planet's natural energy fields. At first glance, this might seem too far-fetched, until you learn that 19th century scientists openly researched these very ideas: electricity in the air, currents within the earth, electrostatic lift, and resonant engines. None of these were considered outlandish ideas at the time. They were actually experimented with and discussed. Then, suddenly, everything fell into oblivion, pushed out of the mainstream of engineering. And at the same time, airships also vanished. This is the most suspicious detail that we cannot overlook. Precisely when these airships disappeared from the sky, the entire ground infrastructure was quietly altered. Towers were repurposed, platforms were demolished, and access to the highest spires was forbidden. Roofs were simplified, and then the entire narrative was rewritten. Airships were gradually branded as failed experiments, then as dangerous, then impractical, and finally buried in the past. Instead, the era of steam engines and internal combustion engines took over. These were noisy, polluting technologies, entirely dependent on fuel things that could be easily taxed, distributed, and controlled. So what if those airships were actually connected to a common atmospheric energy network, a technology no longer constrained by depleting fuel? They would take on an entirely new significance, not merely a means of transport, but a symbol of freedom. This explains why the core question isn't how they operated, but why they were allowed to vanish into oblivion. Because once those airships were wiped from the sky and all the ground infrastructure serving them was repurposed, a magnificent system became invisible. All that remained was silent photographs without explanation, anachronistic architectural structures, and a sky surprisingly empty compared to its once glorious descriptions. And this is where we reach the conclusion of our story, because the real mystery isn't whether these airships were real or not. All evidence suggests they once existed. The true mystery is what happened in an incredibly brief historical moment, when they were collectively erased from the face of the earth. That is also the topic we will delve into in the final episode. The moment the sky suddenly fell silent and an entire grand technology was quietly removed from the pages of history. In this final part, we will no longer discuss creation, but will focus on the disappearance. Because when you take a step back and piece together all the timelines, an undeniable truth will emerge. These airships did not slowly fade away. They didn't disappear due to failed experiments or lose public support after widely publicized accidents. They were once ubiquitous, and then, almost in the blink of an eye, they completely vanished. In the period from the late 1870s to the early 1900s, all records of giant airships suddenly disappeared from historical accounts. Newspapers that once reported weekly on flights suddenly fell silent. Aeronautical societies abruptly disbanded without a word of farewell. Public demonstrations also ceased. Technical magazines completely shifted their focus to other fields, and what didn't happen is just as significant as what was lost. There were no heated public debates, no scathing editorials analyzing the dangers of airships, nor were there detailed news reports of disasters to justify their abandonment, only an absolute silence. When other technologies truly failed, history always documented a turbulent process. Steam engines exploded, bridges collapsed, early railway lines constantly derailed. But with airships, especially the city-sized flying ships described earlier, there was absolutely no recorded transition period. Just a decade prior, they were considered the future of transportation. A decade later, they were regarded as strange relics of a bygone era. A technological revolution cannot simply fade away, so let's look at what rose to replace it at that exact moment. Coal took over, and columns of black smoke became a familiar part of the landscape. Once vibrant cities were now shrouded in a thick haze, and the entire industry was consolidated into the hands of a few. The entire transportation sector shifted to new systems entirely dependent on an endless fuel supply, requiring constant maintenance and under the control of centralized supply chains. Railways, factories, power stations, all were colossal machines that couldn't exist independently. And this is the crux of the matter. You don't need to believe in conspiracy theories to find this suspicious. Only one thing is needed: profit. A system that runs on fuel can be taxed on every drop. A system that relies on infrastructure can have its flow controlled. And a system dependent on a centralized distribution network inherently creates dependency. But conversely, a technology that operates almost silently is absolutely clean and requires virtually no fuel, especially when it harnesses principles from the atmosphere and nature itself. How could it be controlled and profited from? If those airships simply used gas, they would have been controlled long ago. But what if they operated on something entirely different, like atmospheric pressure, resonance, or a form of latent energy in the air? Then they wouldn't be an invention, but a real threat. Not a threat to safety, but a threat to the entire existing power structure. And that's when the eradication campaign began. On paper, in registered patents, then suddenly vanished. The names of inventors were mentioned, only to sink into oblivion. Organizations were mentioned just once, then disappeared forever. And strangely, archives suddenly caught fire. Collections were reclassified in baffling ways. The photos remained, but the story behind them was stripped away. And then, the narrative was deliberately rewritten. Initially, airships were said to be mere experiments. Then, they were labeled dangerous, and finally, completely impractical. Until all that remained was a tiny, faint footnote in history books. Yet the massive infrastructure that once served them didn't disappear. It was simply given a new purpose. Majestic towers suddenly became mere decorations. Sturdy platforms were now tourist observation decks. And the complex systems atop the towers were collectively called architectural embellishments. The physical world was still there, only its interpretation had changed. And once the interpretation changes, the memory of an entire generation will also be distorted. And this is where we reach the final layer of this mystery, because when the official historical records fall silent, another source of information begins to speak. These are the folk legends spanning from Europe to Asia and within ancient Eastern cultures. Stories of cities floating in the clouds still circulate, of ships moving without a sound, of strange lights in the sky that were not fire, and of colossal structures that could be moved silently. Of course, these aren't detailed technical blueprints, they are merely fragmented memories. And where books no longer record, memories stubbornly persist. Think about it, it's no coincidence that these stories resurface just as airships were erased from public records. When a technology suddenly vanishes, people don't easily forget it, it's just that they no longer have a clear way to talk about it. So it slips into illusions, transforms into myth, and hides within oral traditions. And the only legacy passed down to us is precisely these stories. This isn't proof of a fallen empire, nor is it an assertion of a forbidden technology. Rather, It's a pattern of something that once existed and was incredibly effective. It was once documented, considered commonplace, only to then be quietly removed from humanity's collective narrative. Airships didn't merely disappear from the skies, they were also erased from the very currents of history. And once you recognize this pattern, you'll start seeing it everywhere, from magnificent structures buried deep underground to tunnels long since filled in, or in groundbreaking technologies that only briefly flared up, then faded forever. Because technology never disappears alone, it drags fading memories along with it. And often, the only trace left is a vague feeling that something once worked incredibly well, something that, by all accounts, no one should be allowed to remember anymore.